Thank you, Naveen. And welcome to the afternoon session, 2:30 in the afternoon. I see there are even some Italians here who have stayed up to join during siesta period the session this afternoon. So yes, the objective of the discussion this afternoon is to delineate the task of a historian and to define the connection between exegesis and history. Quite a challenging topic that they have been given, and we are very interested to hear what they will have to say to guide us in our conversation about exegesis and hermeneutics. Our first speaker this afternoon is Professor Marc van de Mieroop, Professor of Ancient Near Eastern History. He has been writing about the age of Alexander of Macedon, teaching at Columbia University. He has taught at Oxford and at Yale University. He is the director of Columbia Center for Ancient Near Eastern Mediterranean Studies and the founding editor of the Journal of Ancient Near Eastern History. He is the author of over 100 articles and reviews and has published numerous books on various aspects of ancient Near Eastern history, Egyptian history, and world history. His most recent volume is titled Before and After Babel, Writing as Resistance in the Ancient Near Eastern Empires, recently published by Oxford, and I really like that title, Writing as Resistance in the Ancient Near Eastern Empires. So welcome, Professor, and to you the word.
Well, let me start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to this very special conference. The scholarship on the ancient Near East has always had close connections to that on the Hebrew Bible since the very beginning of the rediscovery of original materials from ancient Mesopotamia in the mid-19th century of this era. One can even say that the interest in Mesopotamian sources was triggered by the biblical connections they revealed. Well known is the story when George Smith discovered the flood story in the Epic of Gilgamesh in 1872, that when he discovered it, he started to undress himself in public because of his excitement for finding a biblical parallel. And today, some think that he had an epileptic fit. Despite the fact that leading Assyriologists told us to focus on the Eigenbegrifflichkeit of the Babylonian world, its conceptual autonomy or cultural individuality, as a way to save the discipline from self-destruction after the so-called Babel- und Bibelstreit, comparative biblical Near Eastern scholarship continues to thrive. Journals such as the Journal of Biblical Literature regularly include articles that connect biblical figures to Mesopotamian ones, and books on Assyriological subjects hoping to draw a wider audience are apt to have titles with a biblical reference. For example, The Ark Before Noah, Decoding the Story of the Flood by Irving Finkel. And I must say I'm not innocent in this respect, as my last book, as you just heard, is called Before and After Babel. It is the case that the cultures of ancient Israel and Judah developed within a world that was politically and culturally dominated by the Mesopotamian powers of Babylonia and Assyria. And an understanding of Mesopotamian materials can help in the exegesis of the biblical text. Scholars in the latter discipline should thus be aware of what is going on in ancient Near Eastern research in general. That is a vast discipline, and I will focus here on the work with Mesopotamian sources which dominate the Near Eastern record and their use in historical studies. I use the term history rather broadly. One of the wonderful aspects of the field of ancient Mesopotamian studies is that there is such an abundance of materials on so many different aspects of human life. Politics, society, and the economy are all well documented, and there is also a mass of evidence on intellectual activity, for example, all of which falls within the purview of the historian. I should start with a warning. it would have been possible to give a 30-minute presentation or more for every topic I address here. I can only discuss some scholarship and will not make reference to specific authors whose work I used. This is not because of disregard, but because of time limitations. If I can start with making a general statement, two trends characterize the evolution of scholarship on ancient Mesopotamia in the 21st century. They are not pure innovations, but an expansion of practices from the 20th century and a greater assertiveness about them. The first is an attention to genres of writing that were known and studied before, but now that is done much more systematically and rigorously. The second is an acknowledgement of theoretical stances and practices in the wider discipline of history and the social sciences in general. So let me give you some detail. As you all know, the Mesopotamian textual corpus is vast. A recent estimate claims that more than 1 million cuneiform tablets are held in various collections around the world. Indeed, many of them are administrative documents and they're short, but there are many other subjects treated in them, oftentimes at great length. Today's scholarship devotes much more extensive and systematic attention to some of those than it did in the past century, especially to the corpus of Mesopotamian scholarly writings. While omen lists, for example, the lengthy and methodical Mesopotamian explorations of all aspects of the universe as indications of the future, while they were known and edited, especially in the second half of the 20th century, they were the domain of a relatively small group of Assyriologists. In the last couple decades, many scholars have systematically edited omen series and analyzed their contents for structure and underlying principles. The same is true for lexical lists, or in the field of cultic-related writing, ritual texts, and the prayers quoted in them. Sumero-Akkadian bilingual lamentations, which in the 20th century were considered boring, are now seriously and comprehensively edited and studied. A major part of this work involves the methodical publication of materials excavated sometimes more than a century ago. An exemplary project in this respect is the systematic publication of the cuneiform tablets from the city of Ashur. Massive volumes are devoted to divinatory texts and lexical lists, prayers and incantations, prescriptive ritual texts, and their invocations to the gods. Large Mesopotamian series, such as the incantation series Evil Demons, are now fully edited. Texts that were previously given only occasional attention, such as medical texts, are now taken very seriously. None of these writings were fully ignored or unknown in the past century, and there was very good scholarship on some of them, but other genres, such as works of literature, royal inscriptions, legal and economic documents, and letters were given more attention than these texts in the 20th century. The recent projects require an enormous amount of effort, attention to detail, and perseverance, as indeed the text's repetitive character can be overwhelming to the non-initiate. But they clearly reveal the wealth and diversity of Mesopotamian writings far beyond the text and genres that were standard in earlier presentations of the corpus. The second trend I observe is a greater awareness of theories, methodologies, and concerns that are current in humanistic and social science scholarship in general. Following those can be confusing in that there has been a quick succession of what is often called turns in broader scholarship. The linguistic turn, with a focus on language, the cultural turn, which examines the past through cultural experience, symbols and attitudes, the affective turn, interested in emotions, the sensory turn, examining the five senses and others. Particular interests have been promoted oftentimes, or even always, because of what are considered pressing concerns in today's world. The environment, and especially the climate these days, gender, and not only binary, male-female, but also third gender, transgender, and so on. Identity, not only racial, but also social, sexual, intellectual, and so on. Disability and animal-human interactions. There's a profusion of interests, many of which can be studied based on ancient Near Eastern sources. Sometimes one feels that they are fads and can be seen as an obsession with today's problems, while pure, quote-unquote pure, historical research is ignored. There are debates, sometimes acrimonious, ongoing among historians on these matters. Assyriologists may feel disconnected from them because they work with such ancient materials. The great French Assyriologist Jean Bottero did write an article in the 1980s called In Defense of a Useless Science. But that is a chimera, a dream. Theoretical stances or biases influence how we as scholars of the ancient Near East work, and we should be aware of them, as well as apply them to our own benefit. I think this has become clearer and much better acknowledged in recent decades than it did in the past. During a conference held in the United States in 1991, with a somewhat optimistic aim, I think, to chart the course of ancient Near Eastern studies in the 21st century, most participants pleaded for a contextualization of the materials they studied. And some were quite despondent about the lack of theoretical awareness of their colleagues at that moment. This is, to an extent, no longer true today. I cannot say that everyone participates in this, nor that all the work done is of the best quality or goes beyond quoting a famous theoretician, but there is an awareness of the importance of intellectual trends in the broader academy. And as so many areas of research are involved, I cannot survey all of them. So I will focus on a select number of topics, starting with some that were starting with some where theoretical concerns were strong in the 20th century, then one where that was only true in the early part of that century, and finally, some that deal with issues that most 20th century scholars of the ancient Near East would never have considered. I'll start with economic history, an area of research that with its materialistic concerns has always been more attentive to social science theories than other fields. The later 20th century was rife with debates paralleling those in the study of the ancient economy in general about whether or not one could approach it with the same tools and methods as the modern economy. This was the so-called primitivism, modernism, or substantivist formalist debate. It focused on the structure of the economy. The presence or absence of a market as an exchange mechanism was central in these discussions, which I feel became a dialogue of the deaf, with each side repeating the evidence that supported their viewpoint. That debate has died out now, and now the focus is on economic performance. With few exceptions, it seems that most historians today consider modern concerns to have existed in the ancient Near East: profit, productivity, price fluctuations, economic growth, and so on. Under the influence of the study of the Greco-Roman economy, new institutional economics, a system of analysis developed by the Nobel Prize winner Douglas C. North to deal with contemporary issues, has become readily accepted in Near Eastern studies. It argues reasonably that economies are embedded in social institutions that explain both performance and structure. The approach focuses very much on the exchange of goods, and it seems almost taken for granted that profitability was a normal concern. I should also say that in general, the interest in economic history of the ancient Near East seems to have declined in the 21st century, and a research tool that we are sorely missing is a handbook similar to the Cambridge Economic History of the Greco-Roman world. The ignorance about ancient Near Eastern evidence on the subject by ancient historians in general can be startling, but I have to admit, to a great extent, we ancient Near East scholars have to blame ourselves. A second area where 20th century scholarship did show awareness of approaches outside ancient Near Eastern studies is gender. Feminist concerns in the later part of that century inspired what have been called various waves in the scholarship, from simply adding data on women to traditional approaches, to seeking to reveal the social and representational structures that defined gender roles. For some reason unclear to me, gender ceased to be of interest for a while in the first decade of the 2000s, but that has changed. Some of the new work picks up the still dominant approach of finding women in the record, but meanwhile, gender studies in general have moved away from seeing the issue in binary terms as male-female, and they suggest a fluid continuum instead, with many forms of masculinity and femininity. I'm sure you all have encountered acronyms such as LGBTQIA+, and the current social movements regarding these questions of identity have influenced ancient Near Eastern studies, most prominently those related to homosexuality and third gender. While it is interesting and important to deconstruct the still default position that sees gender as male and female only, one runs the danger of sifting the evidence for the relatively few references that contain exceptions to that rule. It is, in my opinion, more interesting to investigate how gender was constructed in the ancient Near East. Let me move on to a subject where the study of the ancient Near East intersected quite closely with broader scholarship in the earlier 20th century, but stopped doing so later on. That is the subject of religion. Religion is, of course, a vast and complex topic of research with its scholarly traditions and controversies, which you probably are much more familiar with than I am. At the same time, ancient Near Eastern cultures in general, including Mesopotamian cultures, were permeated by religion in all its aspects. The archaeological record reveals numerous temples and cult objects, while textual documentation shows the existence of large priesthoods and the use of religious ideologies by political power, and includes a vast literature that we think had religious importance, such as myths, prayers, omens, and much more. Still, one of the most prominent Assyriologists of the 20th century, A.L. Oppenheim, called a chapter in his influential book, Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization. The chapter was called Why a Mesopotamian Religion Should Not Be Written. He considered the available evidence too disjointed, and more importantly, stated that there is such a wide conceptual gap between us and the ancient Mesopotamians that we are unable to grasp their beliefs. The concept of Eigenbegrifflichkeit, which, as I mentioned before, his Chicago colleague Benno Landsberger had formulated, certainly informed this stance. But others disagreed, and students of ancient Mesopotamian religion tried to understand aspects of it, sometimes explicitly relying on works in religious anthropology, while in the other direction, ancient Mesopotamian materials entered that broader field. The exchange was not always based on deep knowledge, however. I will elaborate further on this by focusing on one aspect of religion, ritual, briefly mentioning some approaches of the 20th century, and then talk about what happened in the last 2 to 3 decades. There's a remarkable amount of text from ancient Mesopotamia that relates to ritual actions, prescriptive rituals, prayers, laments, incantations, and so on, alongside which is a vast body of ritual objects, buildings, and the like. I will just talk about texts. These became known around the same time that religious studies originated in the late 19th century, ritual studies, originated in the late 19th century. And scholars in both disciplines were aware of each other's work. Some Assyriologists who edited and commented upon ritual and mythological text quoted, for example, James Fraser's Golden Bow and supported the myth and ritual school that he inspired. But there was also a strong reaction against this, which became more vocal mid-century, when many stated that comparisons with other cultures did not explain anything. In this opinion, the philologist should clarify the text indeed, which in reality often essentially led to a paraphrase of the text, the ancient text, in a modern language. Some scholars divorced ritual from religion in general, claiming the texts were works of literature in antiquity accessible to the very few alone. Now, recently, ancient Mesopotamian scholarship has started to reconsider rituals within an anthropological context. Now, one that sees them as social rather than as religious acts. Since rituals are, in essence, actions according to established rules, they are performances in which members of communities participate and thus create or reinforce themselves as a community. Rituals, such as the Babylonian New Year's festival, are studied now as identity-forming occasions. The lengthy Sumero-Akkadian bilingual lamentations are now studied as spoken texts, whose sounds made an impact on the audiences who heard them. This may not increase their utility in our understanding of Mesopotamian religious beliefs, but does clarify their importance in the cultures. Now, the social aspect of ritual is also central in the explicit revival of the ideas of rites of passage, which the anthropologist Arnold van Gennep first formulated in 1909. That theory argues that key moments in a person's life are universally marked by rituals, and some ancient Near East scholars have applied the ideas of departure, liminal stage, and return onto Mesopotamian sources. And other approaches from anthropology, queer theory, and so on have been tested out recently as well. The three areas of research I've mentioned so far can be said to have connections to the 20th century scholarly interests, even if they took them in very different directions and sometimes, in my opinion, unfairly, did not acknowledge the earlier scholarship. Now, I want to end with some fields of inquiry that were fully or almost fully absent before and would have startled the 20th century. In the 20th century, most scholars had they been asked about them. The first is more a method, relying on a tool that was previously unavailable to most scholars, relying on the computer. Social network analysis, SNA, is a methodology in the social sciences that allows for the recreation of webs of interactions between individuals and other entities, not only their direct links, but also those with intermediaries, and to measure the intensity of these interactions. Well, Assyriologists used archival reconstructions to organize corpora of texts and investigate the activities and relationships of individuals or offices. Now much more complex and intricate ties can be revealed through a system of coding that computers can analyze. And I must admit that it is beyond me how this is done in practice. The SNA method seems to have been most usefully applied to large corpora of texts such as late Babylonian business documents or Neo-Assyrian royal correspondence, where it is impossible for a single scholar to keep track of all the details. In the study of social structures, it draws the emphasis away from powerful individuals or powerful offices, which in the 20th century were the center of attention. And I must admit, I myself published several works of that nature. Now more attention is given to the strength of relationships, which is visually expressed through the thickness of lines, and there is a greater ability for comparison between different moments in time and between different corpora. The social network theory is a method to investigate questions that were asked before, but using new tools to do so. There's also a trend to ask new questions in today's scholarship. One such question relates to emotions. Can we get a sense of how ancient Mesopotamians expressed anger, fear, happiness, love, joy, jealousy, and such other basic human feelings? Interest in this topic, I think, was triggered by developments in studies of the Greco-Roman world, and here biblical scholars were ahead of Mesopotamian ones. It was common to say that Mesopotamian sources were frustratingly silent when it came to expressing emotions. I myself wrote that one is often struck by the apparent lack of passion when reading through the vast corpus that shows the most direct interpersonal contact, that is, the letter corpus. In the old Assyrian correspondence, for example, there is an obsession with practical matters when spouses write to each other and when they express irritation and the like. It seems to have been triggered by when they express irritation, it seems to have been triggered more by poor business decisions than by lack of affection. Likewise, in the visual record, Assyrian reliefs, for example, show people with straight faces when standing next to such gruesome scenes as the decapitation of their own son. Recently, other scholars objected and urged for a careful reading of letters, royal inscriptions, literary works, and the visual arts to correct this impression. There are challenges, however. Although surely every human being has and had emotions, the ways they are expressed are culturally determined. Studies also have to differentiate between the terminology of emotions, let's say discourse on emotions, and emotional discourse, that is, how they are expressed through signs. We need to look for emotional practices, that is, bodily acts of experience and expression that can be traced in the historical record. We may interpret going red in the face as a sign of embarrassment, but was that the case in ancient Mesopotamia? With respect to terminology, there is also a great danger that translators adjust their wording in order to render emotions they put into the ancient author's mouth. In an old Assyrian letter, for example, a young man writes to a young woman that the marriage arrangements with her parents have been concluded and that he wants her to come to him. And in that letter, he states in Akkadian, I'll say it in Akkadian, Vedaku. We can translate this in two different ways. He is alone, meaning by himself, or he is lonely. Obviously, these are two different translations and they give very different meanings to his request. Linked to the question of emotions is the recent interest in the senses, that is, how humans experienced through vision, hearing, touch, smell, and taste. In this respect, too, ancient Near Eastern studies are following a trend in other historical scholarship, the so-called sensory turn. As with emotions, every human being has sensory experiences, but these again are culturally conditioned. And the five-part division we take for granted is not universal, nor the body-mind dualism that characterizes Western thought. It is indeed the case that when we study rituals, the topic I discussed earlier on, we need to remember that participants experienced sounds such as bell ringing, smells such as incense, and sights such as cult objects and movements by officiants. There is now a handbook of the senses in the ancient Near East, which is more than 700 pages long, with contributions treating texts in multiple languages and in the archaeological and visual records. A related new interest is that in color, which has inspired the publication of several volumes in recent years. As you can see, there are many new initiatives in the study of the ancient Near East, and I could have mentioned others. Individual studies oftentimes do not just address one of the newer interests, but combine several of them. For example, in a very recent collection of essays on gender, one contribution applied social network theory, and another investigated how smell and gender intersect. One can get the impression that there is something like a free-for-all, where every fad in other fields of scholarship is picked up, and in which the ancient evidence is forced to provide answers on questions previously never asked. I do think that the two major trends I mentioned, the full publication of corpora previously given less attention, and the application of theoretical approaches developed in other disciplines, can be linked. A better awareness of the full textual record from ancient Mesopotamia has enabled asking new questions and provided insights in aspects of life and cultures, insights in aspects of life and culture less well documented in myths, royal inscriptions, and the other genres that were the focus of earlier research. Not all of the new research will stand up to later scrutiny, and I do believe that asking the questions has great value, and in general, once again, reveals how rich, fascinating, and worthy of study the materials from the ancient Near East are. Thank you.